Our sermon text this morning is taken from 1 Kings, beginning at some verses in chapter 6 for context. This is in the midst of a long narrative about Solomon's building of the Jerusalem temple and its dedication. And so we start with chapter 6, verses 11 through 13. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon, concerning this house that you are building. If you will walk in my statutes, obey my ordinances, and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will establish my promise with you that I made to your father David. I will dwell among the Israelites and will not forsake my people Israel. And then moving ahead to chapter 8, verse 1, then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the ancestral houses of the Israelites, before King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. All the people of Israel assembled to King Solomon at the festival in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th month. And all the elders of Israel came, and the priests carried the ark. So they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought them up. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. Then the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim made a covering above the ark and its poles. The poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. They are there to this day. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses had placed there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites when they came out of the land of Egypt. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand and minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Then Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell forever. May God bless this reading of the word. Worship spaces and congregations come in all shapes and sizes. The First Church of the Nazarene in Denver, Colorado, provided my first experience worshiping in a megachurch. I was an adult sponsor for Youth Leader Corps in the Rocky Mountain region of the American Baptist churches, and so we took a group of young people to that church on a Sunday, and others went to other churches so that we could experience diverse forms of worship and come back later and compare notes. The sanctuary at First Nazarene in Denver seemed to me to be about the size of a football field. It was immense. And every seat in that sanctuary was a theater seat. And at a certain point before worship began, motorized room dividers rolled back to open up a new section of seating, now in one place, now in another. And I guess that was their way of trying to get people to fill up the front seating first. And to begin the service, a praise group of about 12 young people came out and sang. And then the whole choir suddenly appeared in the choir loft, and each one had their own microphone. And there was a celebrity preacher that day, so a professional video crew was recording the service. And that crew stationed themselves in front of the congregation, making it sort of difficult to see. And it was all quite impressive, but very different from what I was accustomed to. On the other end of the worship spectrum was a little house church in the San Francisco Bay Area that I attended back in the late 1960s during the Jesus movement. The mostly young congregation sat on the floor surrounding the piano in a large living room. And the pastor played the piano, which was positioned so that he was looking out over the congregation packed in on the floor around him. Worship began with a long session of very joyful and spirited congregational singing. And although that living room was packed, we probably would have filled only a very small corner of a large traditional worship space. Our text this morning tells of the dedication of the grand and glorious temple built by King Solomon in Jerusalem. And 1 Kings 7, if you want to look at it later, gives details of the awe-inspiring nature of this worship space. Solomon, you see, was not only building a temple, he was also putting on a display of the wealth and the prestige of his kingdom. And more importantly, King Solomon was centralizing the worship experiences of the people of Israel. Various worship sites were now at last being brought under one roof. But we need some context to know what to make of this grand building project. In 1 Kings 6, verses 11 and 13 that we just read, God issues a word of warning to the mighty King Solomon. God says, concerning this house that you are building, if you will walk in my statutes, obey my ordinances, and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will establish my promise with you. Our text tells us that the old tent of meeting was one of the religious relics brought into the new temple for storage along with the Ark of the Covenant and other relics of an earlier age. Verse 4 of chapter 8 says, so they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. Around the world and throughout time, worship spaces have assumed many different forms. Our worship spaces can inspire us with their grandeur. They can provide us with a quiet place where we can escape the chaos of the world for a time. Sometimes they are simple and sometimes ornate. When I was a child at our American Baptist summer camp in California, Redwood Glen, the chapel was an outdoor worship space in the midst of the California redwoods. The Redwood Chapel, it was called. There was no gold overlay, no pipe organ, just the surrounding stately redwoods that had stood there for centuries, reminding us of God's faithful presence down through the ages. Our church here, like many before, started off with home meetings and then a log structure. And then as the church grew, this beautiful meeting house was erected. Weddings and memorial services have been held in this space. New members have been welcomed, and prayers have been raised in joy and in concern. Ultimately, the measure of a worship space is not the architecture, but the evidence that we, the people of the living God, give that God is active and moving among us. Does our life together point away from us toward Christ? Does our behavior show the fruit of the Spirit? Though it has been many years since this worship space was first constructed, we together are still building a spiritual house to demonstrate the reality of the living God to the world around us. To each congregation and to each new generation, God's challenge to Solomon comes anew. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon concerning this house that you are building. If you will walk in my statutes, obey my ordinances, and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will establish my promise with you. Our text this morning questions us at this point, what kind of house are we building? Whose glory is on display concerning this house that you are building? Although the stories in our text today come from an earlier age, 1 Kings was written to God's people who had been carried off to exile in Babylon. They knew that Solomon's grand and beautiful temple had been destroyed by an invading army. It turned out that the temple was not everlasting, in spite of the king's hope in verses 12 and 13 of our text. Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever." God's people living in exile far away in Babylon knew that no matter how impressive Solomon's temple had been, none of the impressive things that we mortals build will last forever. Concerning this house that you are building, God said. In verse 8, we read, the poles were so long that the ends of the poles that carried the ark were seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from the outside. They are there to this day. God's people in exile, where everything had changed, it seemed, knew that now even the poles from the ark were not there to this day. But the God who had brought an earlier generation out of slavery in Egypt was still with them, even in far-off Babylon. Listen again to verses 3 and 4 of our text. And all the elders of Israel came, and the priests carried the ark. So they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought them up. Those holy things were the reminders of God's presence with God's people throughout past generations. The holy things in our lives are those things in our lives that cannot be replaced by insurance. I reflected on that this past week as I remembered the devastation from natural disasters at home and abroad. What would be left of the homes affected and the lives that were touched? What is left of the holy things for the people touched by fire and flood and earthquake? Our holy things are especially the people who have passed through our lives across the years, the experiences we have, and the pictures and memorabilia that bring those moments to mind again. When Rhonda's parents were about to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary, she contacted their friends and family and asked people to send a word of greeting, some expression of blessing and blessedness. And from the responses, she assembled a blessing book of pictures and letters and various other holy things from her parents' 50 years together and presented the book to them. And I can still remember the look of great joy that came over their faces as they sat down together side by side and paged through that book. If we will pause occasionally and look and listen, we will see that our own lives are full of the holy vessels, those reminders of God's presence and the touch of so many others along the way. For the people of Solomon's time, these holy things were reminders of an earlier, simpler time in the life of the nation. For the people carried away into captivity to Babylon, they would be reminders that no matter the present circumstances, God is with us. In verse 12 of our text, we read this peculiar statement. Excuse me. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness." What could it mean to say that God will dwell in thick darkness? Solomon had built a grand and glorious temple that he hoped would stand forever, but it did not. And years later, King Herod would build a beautiful temple that he too hoped would stand forever, but it did not. But the living God would dwell with God's people even in the darkest of times, even in the times of captivity. We might want to confine God within the walls of this worship space or that, but the God who met the people in the temple is the same God who met them in a tent of meeting in an earlier age. There are the times in our lives of thick darkness, the times of illness, the times of grief, the times of reversal of fortune, or times of exile. God is with us even in the darkest of times. The psalmist wrote, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you." As beautiful as it was, Solomon's temple did not last. Chapter 11 of 1 Kings sums up some of the failures of Solomon's leadership. And if we listen, we can hear God's earlier warning ringing in our ears. "Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon concerning this house that you are building. If you will walk in my statutes, obey my ordinances, and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will establish my promise with you." The God who has promised to be with us even in the thick darkness calls each new generation to faithfulness. Concerning this house that you are building. The God who met the people in Solomon's beautiful temple also went with them into captivity when that temple had been destroyed. Things change, but God's purpose and faithfulness remain. Let us heed God's challenge to us again this morning. Concerning this house that you are building. Amen.